Hello and welcome to the Credible Faith Show. I'm your host, Dr. Paul D. Larson, and in this episode we will be taking a look at the preface and part 1 of 2 of Chapter 1, Exposition of the Argument of Horae Paulinae, or the Truth of the Scripture History of St. Paul Evinced by a comparison of the Epistles which bear his name with the Acts of the Apostles and with one another. And without much more said, let's dive right into the main content. Horae Paulinae, or the Truth of the Scripture History of St. Paul Evinced by a comparison of the Epistles which bear his name with the Acts of the Apostles and with one another, by William Paley, with notes and a supplementary treatise entitled Horae Apologetics, that is, by the Reverend T. R. Burks. London, The Religious Tract Society, 1850. Preface. The Horae Paulinae, ever since its first appearance, has maintained a high and deserved reputation, not only as a decisive argument for the genuineness of St. Paul's epistles and the fidelity of St. Luke's narrative, but as a pattern of sagacious and discriminating historical criticism. The strong proof deducible from undesigned coincidences between separate documents to establish their authenticity, though it must have been felt by many, and may have been partially traced by others in this very case, had never before received so striking a development. No candid reader, after a perusal of the work, can escape the full conviction that the Acts of the Apostles and the Epistles of St. Paul, forming together nearly one half of the New Testament, could neither be the result of fraud on the part of contemporary authors, nor have an artificial origin in later times, but are certainly what they bear upon their face, a genuine history, and authentic letters of the great Apostle of the Gentiles. The present edition of the work embraces several distinct but kindred objects. First of all, it has been endeavored to offer such partial corrections of the original treatise as further study of the subject, aided by the light of more recent criticism, appeared to require. Secondly, and principally, it seemed desirable to extend the argument still further, to glean many coincidences which Paley had overlooked, and to extend the inquiry to the four Gospels. The Horae Apologetics, which forms the second half of this volume, is the fruit of that design. Many particular coincidences are there brought to light, from the Epistles of St. Paul, including that to the Hebrews, from the book of Acts, and, last of all, from the comparison of the Gospels with the incidental statements of the letters and with each other. Their peculiar character here imposed a limit, since the full development of their harmony would involve many inquiries, not easily reconciled with the form of Paley's work and the cumulative nature of the argument. These topics of evidences are reserved, if occasion should arise, for a distinct work. But the present volume embraces nearly all, in the editor's judgment, that admits of being presented in distinct articles and in a popular form. Besides these objects, which refer to the conduct of the argument, it has been endeavored, in agreement with the great purpose of the Society, under whose sanction the work now appears, to impress on the whole inquiry a practical tone. An intellectual conviction that the New Testament writings are genuine is of little worth, unless their saving doctrines are impressed upon the heart. And though I have not thought it desirable, either in the notes or the added treatise, to digress frequently from the direct line of argument, I trust that the whole volume, with the reflections at its close, will commend itself not merely to the intelligence of every thoughtful reader, but to the conscience and heart of the sincere Christian, and serve as a humble contribution to the spread of that knowledge of Christ, revealed in his own word, which alone is able to make men wise unto salvation. Two works of a kindred nature have been consulted in the composition of this treatise. Professor Blunt's, quote, undesigned coincidences, end quote, which, although chiefly occupied with the Old Testament, include some remarks on the New, and Mr. Biley's, quote, supplement to the Horae Paulinae, end quote. The former work, highly valuable in the Old Testament portion, has offered me but slight aid in the present subject, as many of the coincidences there suggested appear to me to be either unimportant or untenable. Those which appeared of real value have been retained, with an acknowledgment of my obligation. The work of Mr. Paley, though I have been compelled to differ from several of his hypotheses, is much richer in fresh materials. I have usually marked the coincidence, where our views agree, though my own conclusions, except in one or two instances, were formed independently. In other cases, I have felt it right to give the reasons for dissent from his views, as in the date of the Epistle to the Galatians. On the other hand, his remarks on the Council, Acts chapter 15, and the probable occasion of the first epistle of St. Peter, appear to me both original and highly valuable. Some use, though more limited, has also been made of the, quote, continuous history of St. Paul, end quote, by the late Canon Tate. Besides these, which are more nearly akin to the present volume in their express object, other critical works have been consulted and examined, especially Hugg's Introduction, Dr. Burton's, quote, Essay on the Book of Acts, end quote, Cresswell's learned, quote, Dissertations on the Gospel Harmony, end quote, and that able and useful work, quote, The Literary History of the New Testament, end quote, whose author, though well known to many, has preferred to conceal his name. Of these I have been perhaps the most indebted to Mr. Greswell's valuable researches, though the accuracy of his reasoning, especially on points of chronology, by no means rivals the extent of his erudition. I have endeavored to express my substantial obligations without encumbering the volume by needless references and incidental discussions, in each case of partial agreement or disagreement. In compliance with the judgment of an honored friend, I have closed the work by a chronological table, the result of my own investigations, and which therefore appears to some disadvantage, apart from the arguments by which it should be sustained. Without pretending to a certainty which is hardly attainable, I feel a strong conviction that the dates, from the death of Herod onward, are within 1 year of the truth, and have given those which seem to me the most probable, within the limits prescribed by the evidence. The scheme of Dr. Burton, to which Mr. Paley refers as authority, is, in my judgment, illogical and erroneous, and refuted by the very authorities on which the professor has chiefly relied. I am glad to perceive that the dates to which I have been independently led agree very nearly with those adopted in the literary history, but the writer does not state whether he has borrowed them from others, or deduced them by his own original inquiries. From his view, however, of the dates of St. John's Gospel and the Catholic Epistles, I am compelled to dissent for many reasons. And now I commend the volume to the blessing of that gracious Lord, whose message of love and mercy it is designed to illustrate, in its irresistible claims on the faith, the reverence, and the practical allegiance of every child of man, who, however unversed in ancient history, can read in his own tongue the inspired writings of the New Covenant, and may there discern in every page the traces of divine wisdom, truth, and holiness. A Preface of T.R. Burks, Kelshall Rectory, November 17, 1849. The Truth of the Scripture History of St. Paul Evinced. Chapter 1. Exposition of the Argument. The volume of Christian Scriptures contains 13 letters purporting to be written by St. Paul. It contains also a book which, amongst other things, professes to deliver the history, or rather memoirs of the history, of this same person. By assuming the genuineness of the letters, we may prove the substantial truth of the history, or by assuming the truth of the history, we may argue strongly in support of the genuineness of the letters. But I assume neither one nor the other. The reader is at liberty to suppose these writings to have been lately discovered in the library of the Escurial, and to come to our hands destitute of any extrinsic or collateral evidence whatever. And the argument I am about to offer is calculated to show that a comparison of the different writings would, even under these circumstances, afford good reason to believe the persons and transactions to have been real, the letters authentic, and the narration in the main to be true. Agreement or conformity between letters bearing the name of an ancient author and a received history of that author's life does not necessarily establish the credit of either, because, number one, the history may, like Middleton's life of Cicero or Jortin's life of Erasmus, have been wholly or in part compiled from the letters, in which case it is manifest that the history adds nothing to the evidence already afforded by the letters. Or, number two, the letters may have been fabricated out of the history, a species of imposture which is certainly practicable, and which, without any accession of proof or authority, would necessarily produce the appearance of consistency and agreement. Or, number three, the history and letters may have been founded upon some authority common to both, as upon reports and traditions which prevailed in the age in which they were composed, or upon some ancient record now lost, which both writers consulted. In which case also the letters, without being genuine, may exhibit marks of conformity with the history, and the history, without being true, may agree with the letters. Agreement, therefore, or conformity, is only to be relied upon so far as we can exclude these several suppositions. Now the point to be noticed is that in the three cases above enumerated, conformity must be the effect of design. Where the history is compiled from the letters, which is the first case, the design and composition of the work are in general so confessed, or made so evident by comparison, as to leave us in no danger of confounding the production with original history, or of mistaking it for an independent authority. The agreement, it is probable, will be close and uniform, and will easily be perceived to result from the intention of the author, and from the plan and conduct of his work. Where the letters are fabricated from the history, which is the second case, it is always for the purpose of imposing a forgery upon the public, and in order to give color and probability to the fraud, names, places, and circumstances found in the history may be studiously introduced into the letters, as well as a general consistency be endeavored to be maintained. But here it is manifest that whatever congruity appears is the consequence of meditation, artifice, and design. The third case is that wherein the history and the letters, without any direct privity or communication with each other, derive their materials from the same source, and, by reason of their common original, furnish instances of accordance and correspondency. This is a situation in which we must allow it to be possible for ancient writings to be placed, and it is a situation in which it is more difficult to distinguish spurious from genuine writings than in either of the cases described in the preceding suppositions, inasmuch as the congruities observable are so far accidental as that they are not produced by the immediate transplanting of names and circumstances out of one writing into the other. But although, with respect to each other, the agreement of these writings be mediate and secondary, yet is it not properly or absolutely undesigned, because with respect to the common original from which the information of the writer proceeds, it is studied and factitious. The case of which we treat must, as to the letters, be a case of forgery, and when the writer who is personating another sits down to his composition, whether we have the history with which we now compare the letters, or some other record before him, or whether we have only loose tradition and reports to go by, he must adapt his imposture, as well as he can, to what he finds in these accounts, and his adaptations will be the result of counsel, scheme, and industry. Art must be employed, and vestiges will appear of management and design. Add to this that in most of the following examples, the circumstances in which the coincidence is remarked are of too particular and domestic a nature to have floated down upon the stream of general tradition. Of the three cases which we have stated, the difference between the first and the two others is that in the first the design may be fair and honest, in the others it must be accompanied with the consciousness of fraud. But in all there is design, In examining, therefore, the agreement between ancient writings, the character of truth and originality is undesignedness, and this test applies to every supposition. For whether we suppose the history to be true, but the letters spurious, or the letters to be genuine, but the history false, or, lastly, falsehood to belong to both, the history to be a fable and the letters fictitious, the same inference will result, that either there will be no agreement between them, or the agreement will be the effect of design. Nor will it elude the principle of this rule to suppose the same person to have been the author of all the letters, or even the author both of the letters and the history, for no less design is necessary to produce coincidence between different parts of a man's own writings, especially when they are made to take the different forms of a history and of original letters, than to adjust them to the circumstances found in any other writing. With respect to those writings of the New Testament which are to be the subject of our present consideration, I think that, as to the authenticity of the Epistles, this argument, where it is sufficiently sustained by instances, is nearly conclusive, for I cannot assign a supposition of forgery in which coincidences of the kind we inquire after are likely to appear. As to the history, it extends to these points. It proves the general reality of the circumstances. It proves the historian's knowledge of these circumstances. In the present instance, it confirms his pretensions of having been a contemporary, and in the latter part of his history a companion of St. Paul. In a word, it establishes the substantial truth of the narration, and a substantial truth is that which, in every historical inquiry, ought to be the first thing sought after and ascertained. It must be the groundwork of every other observation. The reader, then, will please to remember this word undesignedness, as denoting that upon which the construction and validity of our argument chiefly depend.